Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. And leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. It was supposed to be a shortcut. That's how these things always start, isn't it? A simple, stupid decision that peels back the layer of reality you thought you knew and shows you the rot underneath. I was driving from Colorado back home to California, a trip I'd made a dozen times. I was trying to beat a storm system that was sprawling across Nevada, a big, ugly purple splotch on the weather app. But I was young, overconfident, and I figured I could outrun it. I couldn't have been more wrong. The rain started just after I crossed the state line. It wasn't a gentle shower, it was a biblical deluge. The kind of rain that makes your windshield wipers scream in protest as they fight a losing battle. The highway slowed to a crawl, a long, glittering snake of red taillights. Frustrated and impatient, I did what any tech-reliant 20-something would do. I checked my phone's GPS, and there it was. A thin, gray line branching off the main highway. Stillwater Road. The GPS promised it would shave a whole hour off my trip, bypassing the gridlock and spitting me back out on the interstate 50 miles down the road. A shortcut. Looking back, the name itself should have been a warning. Stillwater. There's nothing still about running water, and I was about to find that out. But at the moment, it just sounded rustic, maybe even a little scenic. So, I took the exit. The difference was immediate. The 4-lane highway vanished, replaced by a 2-lane blacktop slick with rain. The world went dark. No streetlights, no other cars. Just my headlights cutting a tunnel through the downpour and the dense, black shapes of pine trees crowding the road. For the first 10 minutes, it was fine. I was making good time. I felt smart, like I'd found a secret cheat code for travel. Then the blacktop ended. Abruptly, it just crumbled away into a muddy, gravel path. My GPS, bless its lying electronic heart, insisted this was the way. Continue on Stillwater Road, the cheerful, robotic voice said. I slowed the car to a crawl, my tires crunching nervously on the loose stones. The road was getting narrower, more overgrown. Branches scraped against my windows like bony fingers. This wasn't a road. This was a glorified logging trail at best. The thought of turning back crossed my mind, but pride is a powerful, foolish thing. I'd already come this far, and reversing on this narrow, muddy track in a torrential downpour seemed just as risky as pushing forward. So I kept going, and that's when my car sank. It wasn't dramatic. The engine didn't stall. The car just settled. The tires spun uselessly, spitting mud against the undercarriage. A sickening lurch, and then nothing. I was stuck. Well and truly stuck. I killed the engine and the world went silent, save for the relentless drumming of rain on the roof. I tried my phone. No signal. Of course, the glowing GPS map on the screen was now just a useless icon of my car, sitting motionless in a vast, empty sea of green. I sat there for maybe 20 minutes, a cold knot of dread tightening in my stomach. Panic was starting to bubble up. I was in the middle of nowhere, in a storm, with no way to call for help. My only option was to wait for the rain to stop, but it sounded like it was settling in for the night. That's when I saw it. Through the rain-streaked windshield, far down the path, I saw a light. A single, faint, yellow square of light. A house. Relief washed over me so intensely it almost made me dizzy. Someone lived out here. They'd have a phone, a landline. They could call a tow truck. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot I had. I grabbed my jacket, pulled the hood up, and stepped out of the car into the storm. The mud was thick and greedy, sucking at my sneakers with every step. The air was cold and smelled of wet pine needles and damp earth. The walk was longer than I thought. The light seemed to keep its distance, a flickering beacon in the oppressive dark. As I got closer, the shape of the house resolved itself from the shadows. It was an old 2-story farmhouse, the kind with a wraparound porch and a steep, peaked roof. The paint was peeling, and one of the shutters on an upstairs window was hanging from a single hinge, banging a lonely rhythm against the siding in the wind. The single light came from a downstairs window. It looked uninhabited, neglected, but the light was on. Someone had to be home. I climbed the creaking wooden steps to the porch, my footsteps echoing unnaturally loud over the rain. I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering over the heavy wooden door. Every horror movie I'd ever seen was screaming in my head. But what choice did I have? Stay in my car all night and risk freezing, or knock on the door? I knocked. The sound was swallowed by the storm. I knocked again, harder this time. After a long moment, I heard the sound of a bolt being drawn back. The door opened a crack, and a sliver of warm, yellow light cut across the dark porch. An old woman's face appeared in the gap. She was ancient, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, her eyes small and dark like beads. "Yes," she rasped, her voice thin and dry like old paper. "I'm so sorry to bother you," I stammered, rainwater dripping from my hood. "My car, it's stuck in the mud, back up the road. My phone has no signal. I was wondering if I could please use your phone to call for a tow truck." The woman stared at me for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, a slow smile spread across her lips, revealing pale gums. "Stuck, you say? In this awful weather? Of course, dear. Don't stand out there in the cold. Come in, come in." She opened the door wider, and I practically fell inside, overcome with gratitude. The warmth of the house enveloped me. It smelled of wood smoke, cinnamon, and something else. Something dusty and sweet, like old potpourri. An old man was sitting in a rocking chair by a crackling fireplace. He looked just as ancient as the woman, with a bald head and a fringe of white hair. He nodded at me slowly as I entered. "Got another one, Martha," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Hush now, Arthur." The woman, Martha, said, closing the door behind me. "The poor thing is soaked to the bone. Got her car stuck right down the lane." She turned to me, her smile unwavering. "Arthur's just teasing. We don't get many visitors out this way. The phone is just in the kitchen. But first, let's get you a hot cup of tea to warm you up." I couldn't refuse. Her hospitality seemed so genuine, so kind. I followed her into a large country-style kitchen. The house was strange. It was immaculately tidy, but everything was covered in a thin layer of dust. And there were dolls everywhere. Porcelain dolls sitting on shelves, cloth dolls propped up on chairs, glass-eyed dolls staring from the top of the refrigerator. Their little painted smiles seemed to follow me. It was creepy, but I chalked it up to an old lady's hobby. Martha bustled around, getting a kettle on the stove. I stood awkwardly in the doorway. "The phone?" I asked gently. "Right over there, dear," she said, pointing with a bony finger to an old rotary phone on the wall. I picked up the receiver. There was no dial tone. It was completely dead. "I'm sorry," I said, a flicker of my earlier panic returning. "It doesn't seem to be working." Martha turned from the stove, a look of surprise on her face. "Oh dear me. The storm must have knocked the line out. It does that sometimes. Well, no matter. You can't go anywhere tonight anyway. A tow truck wouldn't come out on this road in this weather. You'll just have to stay the night with us. We have a lovely guest room." Stay the night. The words hung in the air. My mind was racing. I didn't want to stay. The house, the dolls, the unnervingly pleasant couple. It was all setting my teeth on edge. But the alternative was sleeping in a cold car stuck in the mud. That's very kind of you," I said, forcing a smile. But I couldn't impose. "Nonsense." Arthur's voice boomed from the other room. "We insist. We can't have you out there all alone." And just like that, it was settled. I was staying. Martha gave me a cup of tea that tasted faintly of herbs I didn't recognize, and we sat in the living room by the fire. They asked me questions about myself, where I was from, where I was going. It felt less like a conversation and more like an interrogation, but their smiles never faltered. I tried to ignore the dozens of glass eyes watching me from the shelves. After a while, Martha said she needed to go check on something upstairs. Arthur stayed with me, rocking silently in his chair. The only sound was the fire, the rain, and the rhythmic banging of that loose shutter outside. I must have started to doze off, lulled by the warmth, because I was startled awake by the sound of voices from the top of the stairs. It was Martha, but she wasn't alone. She was whispering. I couldn't make out the words at first, just the low hiss of her voice. I strained to listen, nearly ready. She looked so much like her, Arthur. The same hair. Arthur's low rumble answered. "It's been too long. Do you think she'll be happy to see us?" "Of course, she will," Martha whispered back, her voice filled with a strange, fervent excitement. "Eliza is finally coming home. We just have to get her ready." Eliza. The name sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the storm. Who was Eliza? My sleepiness vanished, replaced by pure, adrenaline-fueled fear. This wasn't right. I glanced around the room, my eyes darting everywhere. I saw the phone in the kitchen, a dead weight on the wall. I saw the dolls, their smiling faces now looking menacing, like a silent, waiting audience. My eyes landed on the coat rack by the door. Next to my jacket, there was a small, child-sized yellow raincoat. It was caked in dried mud, as if it had been worn by a child who'd been playing in a storm a very, very long time ago. I had to get out. Now. I stood up slowly. "I think I'll just go check on my car," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "Maybe the rain is letting up." Arthur stopped rocking. He looked at me, and for the first time, the folksy smile was gone. His eyes were cold and hard. "I don't think that's a good idea. Martha is preparing your room. You mustn't be rude." "I'm not trying to be rude, sir. I just—" "Sit down," he said. It wasn't a request. From the top of the stairs, Martha's voice called out, sharp and anxious. "Is she leaving, Arthur? Don't let her leave!" "Eliza can't leave again." I didn't wait to hear any more. I bolted for the door. I fumbled with the bolt, my hands shaking uncontrollably. Arthur heaved himself out of his chair with surprising speed, shouting my name, or rather, not my name. "Eliza, no." I wrenched the door open and ran out onto the porch, into the blinding rain. Martha was screaming from inside the house now, a high, piercing wail of despair that didn't sound human. "Don't go into the storm! Not again! Come back!" I didn't look back. I leaped off the porch and plunged into the mud, scrambling, falling, and getting up again. I ran blindly down the dark, muddy path, the screams from the house chasing me. I glanced over my shoulder once. The porch light was on, and I could see their two silhouettes standing in the doorway, watching me. They weren't chasing me. They were just watching. I don't know how long I ran. I just ran towards where I thought the main road was. I eventually stumbled out of the woods, covered in mud and gasping for air, right onto the slick blacktop of the real Stillwater Road. A pair of headlights cut through the darkness. It was a semi-truck. I stood in the middle of the road and waved my arms frantically. The truck screeched to a halt just feet from me. The driver, a big man with a kind face, helped me into his cab. He took one look at my terrified, mud-caked state and didn't ask too many questions. He just drove. He called the police for me. They went to check on my car the next morning. They found it, stuck in the mud, just as I'd said. But there was no farmhouse. There was no turn-off. The old logging trail I had turned down was there, but it was heavily overgrown and ended at a collapsed wooden fence about 100 yards in. The police report said it had been impassable for years. I did some research later, online, in old county archives. I found it. An article from a local newspaper dated 1958. It was about a couple, Arthur and Martha Gable, who lived on a remote farm off Stillwater Road. They had a 7-year-old daughter named Eliza. One stormy night, she wandered out of the house and was swept away in a flash flood. They never found her body. The article said the parents slowly lost their minds to grief, staying in that house, waiting for her to come home. They were found dead in the house years later. An old photo accompanied the article. It was a grainy black and white picture of a little girl with pigtails and a bright smile. She had my hair. She had my eyes. The last thing I remember from that house, the detail that still wakes me up in a cold sweat, wasn't the dolls or the dead phone. It was a framed photograph on the mantelpiece, just next to the fireplace, a picture of little Eliza Gable, and she was wearing a small, yellow raincoat. I've always been a city person. I love the noise, the energy, the feeling of being part of something huge and alive. I found comfort in the anonymity of apartment buildings, in being just one small light among thousands. I used to think there was safety in height, that living 15 floors up put you beyond the reach of the world's creepiness. I learned that some things don't need stairs. I'd moved into a new apartment about 6 months prior. It was a modern high-rise in the city center, all glass and steel. My unit was on the 15th floor, with a small balcony that offered a spectacular view of the cityscape and, Directly opposite, another identical apartment tower. The apartment across from mine was empty. It had been for the entire time I'd lived there. I could see into its dark, vacant windows every night. The storm started on a Tuesday. It wasn't just a storm. It was a week-long monsoon that settled over the city like a wet, gray blanket. The wind howled through the concrete canyons, and the rain came down in sheets, blurring the lights of the buildings into a watercolor painting. For the first couple of days, it was cozy. I worked from home, made soup, and enjoyed the excuse to stay inside. But by Thursday, the confinement was starting to get to me. The constant drumming of rain and the wail of the wind were no longer comforting. They were grating. That's when I first heard the tapping. It was late, probably around 2 a.m. I was in bed trying to read, but the wind was so loud it was rattling my window pane. Over the general noise of the storm, I heard a distinct sound. Tap, 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 tap. It was sharp, rhythmic. It sounded like it was coming from my bedroom window. I sat up listening. It came again. Tap, 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 tap. My logical brain immediately kicked in. I was on the 15th floor. It had to be a loose piece of siding, or maybe a branch from a potted plant on my balcony being blown against the glass. I got up, pulled back the curtain, and peered out. The balcony was empty except for a lone, sad-looking chair. The rain was lashing down, visibility was near zero. I couldn't see anything out of the ordinary. I went back to bed, telling myself it was just the storm playing tricks on me. The next night it happened again. Same time, same rhythmic tapping. This time I was ready for it. I lay in the dark listening. It wasn't random, like the wind would be. It was deliberate, a pattern. Tap, tap, pause, tap, 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 tap. I felt a prickle of unease. I tried to record it on my phone, but the microphone just picked up the roar of the wind and rain. I tried to ignore it, to sleep, but the sound wormed its way into my brain. As I lay there, a huge fork of lightning lit up the sky, illuminating the entire world outside my window for a split second, and in that flash of white light, my heart stopped. Across the way, in the dark, empty apartment, I saw a figure, a silhouette of a person, standing on the balcony, looking directly at my window. It was just for a second, then the darkness swallowed it again. I sat bolt upright, my breath caught in my throat. It had to be a trick of the light, a reflection. It couldn't be a person. That apartment was vacant. I knew it was. The building management had told me. Maybe it was a maintenance worker, a realtor showing the unit. At 2 in the morning, in the middle of a historic storm. No, it didn't make sense. I spent the rest of the night with my back against my headboard, staring at the window, waiting for another flash of lightning, but none came. By morning, in the gray, rainy daylight, the balcony opposite was empty. I felt foolish. I was just tired, stressed from being cooped up. My imagination was running wild. But that night the tapping returned, and something new happened. My phone, which was on the nightstand beside me, buzzed. I glanced at it. A Bluetooth pairing request. I didn't recognize the device name. It was just a random string of letters and numbers, X7BK9L4M. I dismissed it, thinking it was probably a neighbor's new gadget. But a few minutes later, it buzzed again. Same request, same device. I denied it again. It happened 5 or 6 times, always a few minutes after I'd hear the tapping on the window. A cold, creeping dread began to take hold of me. This wasn't a coincidence. The tapping, the silhouette, the pairing requests. Someone was watching me, and they were close. Close enough for a Bluetooth signal. I became paranoid. I taped over the camera on my laptop. I started keeping my blinds shut, even during the day. The feeling of being watched was constant, a physical weight on my shoulders. The cozy apartment now felt like a glass cage, and I was the specimen inside. The storm reached its peak on Saturday night. The wind shrieked like a dying animal, and the rain hammered against the building with a force that seemed determined to break it apart. I was huddled on my sofa, trying to lose myself in a movie, when it happened. The lights flickered once, twice, and then went out. The entire building was plunged into an unnerving silence, the kind of deep, profound quiet that only happens when a city's power grid fails. The only sound was the storm raging outside. My emergency flashlight was in the kitchen. I fumbled for my phone, using its screen to light the way. As I stood up, I heard it. The tapping. It wasn't on my bedroom window anymore. It was on the large sliding glass door of the living room balcony. And it wasn't the quiet, rhythmic tapping from before. It was frantic, hard, demanding, like someone desperate to get in. I froze, standing in the middle of my living room, my phone's light trembling in my hand. My blood ran cold. Who could be out there? How could anyone be out there? I was 15 floors up. It was impossible. My mind refused to process it. My phone buzzed in my hand, the screen lighting up the terrified expression on my face. It was another pairing request. I looked down, my hands shaking so badly I could barely read the screen. The device name wasn't a random string of characters anymore. It was two words that made my soul turn to ice. Letty Mian. A massive, brilliant flash of lightning lit up the entire apartment, brighter than daylight, and the source of the tapping was revealed. Pressed against the glass of my balcony door was a face. It wasn't human. Not really. It was long and gaunt, deathly pale, with skin that looked slick and wet. Its hair was plastered to its skull, thin and black. But the eyes were just two wide, black pools of nothing. And it was smiling. A wide, unnatural grin that stretched its lips too far. It wasn't standing on the balcony. There was nothing beneath its feet. It was just there, floating in the storm 15 stories above the ground. A scream tore from my throat, raw and animalistic. I stumbled backward, falling over my coffee table. The lightning vanished, and the room was dark again. But the image was burned onto the back of my eyelids. The tapping stopped. It was replaced by a new sound. The sound of glass cracking under immense pressure. I scrambled on all fours, my phone skittering across the floor. I didn't care about the light anymore. I crab walked backward until my back hit the far wall, my eyes glued to the balcony door. I pulled my knees to my chest and just waited. Waited for the sound of shattering glass. Then an earth-shattering sirene echoed through the apartment. It wasn't the balcony door. It was the window. The living room window next to the door. It exploded inward, sending a shower of glass and rain into the room. The wind howled through the new opening, whipping my curtains into a frenzy. I didn't see anything enter. I just felt a sudden, bone-deep cold fill the room, a cold that had nothing to do with the storm. I ran. I scrambled down the hallway to my bedroom, slammed the door, and locked it. I shoved my dresser in front of it, my breath coming in ragged, painful sobs. I huddled in the corner of my room, in the dark, listening. I could hear something moving in my living room, a soft, wet, shuffling sound. I found my other phone, my work phone, in my bag and managed to dial 9911, my voice a choked whisper. I told them someone was in my apartment. I couldn't explain how they got in. I just begged them to come. The wait was the longest 10 minutes of my life. I could hear the shuffling stop outside my bedroom door. I held my breath, listening for the doorknob to turn. But it never did. There was just silence. When the police finally arrived, they had to break down my front door. They found me hysterical, barricaded in my bedroom. The apartment was a mess. The living room window was shattered, glass everywhere. The floor was soaked with rain. But there was no one there. They searched the whole unit, the balcony, everything. They found no one. What they did find was a single long, wet handprint on the wall next to the broken window. The fingers were too long, too thin. The officer who saw it just looked at me, then looked away. They wrote it up as vandalism, probably caused by the storm. A pressure differential, they said, could have shattered the window. They couldn't explain the handprint. They couldn't explain the Bluetooth requests. They treated me like a traumatized woman whose mind had played tricks on her. I broke my lease the next day. I packed my things and left, and I never looked back. I live in a ground floor house now, in a quiet suburb. I have thick curtains on every window. I've thrown out every Bluetooth device I own. People still think I'm crazy when I try to explain it. But I know what I saw. I know it was real. And every time it rains, I can still feel it. The feeling of being watched from the sky, and I can still hear that tapping not on the glass but inside my own head. Tap, 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 tap. Camping was our thing. Me, my girlfriend Chloe, and our two best friends, Liam and Ben. We weren't casual campers, we were the real deal. We'd go deep into national parks, miles from any trail, and live off the grid for a few days. We loved the isolation, the challenge, The feeling of being completely self-reliant. We thought we were prepared for anything nature could throw at us. We learned that there are things in nature that have nothing to do with nature at all. We chose a spot in a sprawling, remote state forest known for its deep woods and pristine rivers. Our chosen campsite was perfect, a small, flat clearing nestled in a grove of old-growth trees, about 50 feet from a gentle, babbling creek. It was a good 4-mile hike from where we parked the car. The weather forecast had been clear for the entire weekend. Blue skies, mild temperatures, perfect conditions. We spent the first day setting up our tents, building a fire pit, and exploring the immediate area. It was idyllic. The air was clean. The only sounds were the birds and the creek, and the company was perfect. That night we sat around the fire, telling stories, feeling like the only 4 people on the planet. The rain started around 3 a.m. It woke me from a dead sleep. It wasn't a gradual thing, it was like a switch was flipped. One moment, silence, the next, a deafening roar as water hammered down on our tent. Chloe stirred beside me. "What is that?" she mumbled. "Just rain," I said, trying to sound confident. "It'll pass." It didn't pass. It got worse. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, making the whole tent shudder. We could hear Liam and Ben shouting from their tent next door. Ben unzipped our tent flap and poked his head in, his face pale in the light of his headlamp. "This isn't on the forecast," he said, water streaming down his face. "And the creek. You guys need to see the creek." We scrambled out of our tent into the chaos. The gentle, babbling brook we'd camped beside was gone. In its place was a churning, brown monster. It had already swelled over its banks and was eating away at the edge of our clearing. It was rising fast. Terrifyingly fast. "We have to go," Liam shouted over the wind. "No." Higher ground. There was no time to pack. We just grabbed our backpacks, which thankfully had our essentials. Water filters, first aid, flashlights, and abandoned everything else. Tents, sleeping bags, coolers, all of it. We ran from the rising water, scrambling up the steep, muddy hillside behind our campsite. The rain was so thick it was like moving through water. Every flash of lightning showed the river growing wider, angrier, swallowing the place where we had been sleeping just minutes before. After a grueling climb in the dark, we found it an old, abandoned fire warden's tower. It was little more than a wooden shack on stilts, rickety and weathered, but it was on high ground, and it was shelter. We broke a window to get inside, hauling ourselves into the small, single room. It was musty and smelled of decay, but it was dry. We were safe. Or so we thought. We huddled together on the floor, shivering, listening to the symphony of the storm outside. We were exhausted, scared, but also relieved to be out of the immediate danger. We figured we'd just have to wait out the storm, and then face the long hike back in the morning. As the hours passed, the adrenaline wore off and a deep, bone-weary exhaustion set in. That's when we heard the humming. It was faint at first, almost lost in the noise of the rain and wind. A low, melodic sound. A woman's voice. She was humming a simple tune, like a lullaby. "Do you guys hear that?" Chloe whispered, her eyes wide. We all fell silent, listening. It was unmistakable. A soft, sad melody that seemed to be coming from outside, moving around the base of our tower. "It's just the wind," Liam said, though he didn't sound convinced. The wind whistling through the trees or something. But it wasn't the wind. The wind was a chaotic roar. This was a pattern, a tune. It would fade as if moving away, then grow louder as if coming closer. We sat there in the dark, listening to this impossible sound for what felt like an eternity. The initial fear began to curdle into a specific, targeted dread. Who would be out here, in this storm, humming? Ben was the one who started to unravel first. He'd always been the most sensitive, the most superstitious of our group. He was sitting with his back against the wall, his knees drawn up to his chest, rocking back and forth slowly. "It's a warning," he whispered, his voice trembling. "She's warning us." "Who's warning us, man?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "There's no one out there." "I saw her," Ben said, looking at me with wide, terrified eyes. "When we were running from the river. Just for a second, in the lightning, there was a woman standing by the water. She was wearing a white dress. She was just watching the flood." We tried to calm him down. We told him it was the stress, the exhaustion, his mind playing tricks on him. A trick of the light. But he was inconsolable. He just kept whispering about the woman in white, about the humming being a song for the drowned. A couple of hours later, the humming seemed to fade away. The rain lessened to a steady, hard drizzle. We were all on edge, but the immediate sense of a presence had passed. We tried to get some rest. I remember drifting into a light, uneasy sleep, with Chloe's head on my shoulder. I was woken up by a cold draft. The door of the shack, which we had barred with a rotten piece of timber, was slightly ajar. A cold, wet wind was blowing in, and Ben was gone. Ben, Liam called out, his voice tight with panic. We all jumped to our feet. His backpack was still there, but he was gone. We rushed to the door and looked out into the gray, pre-dawn light. The world was a dripping, muddy mess. The river was still a raging torrent below us, but the immediate area was clear. There was no sign of Ben. We have to go find him? Chloe cried. No, we wait until it's fully light, Liam said, his voice firm, taking charge. It's too dangerous to go searching in the dark. He can't have gone far. We stood by the door, calling his name until our throats were raw. There was no answer but the dripping of the trees and the distant roar of the river. As we stood there, shivering, the humming started again. This time it was different. It wasn't distant. It was close. It sounded like it was coming from the trees right at the edge of the clearing around the tower. And then we heard another voice. Ben's voice. It was a whisper, coming from the darkness just beyond the reach of our headlamps. She's not trying to hurt us, he whispered. The voice was strangely calm, devoid of any emotion. She's just lonely. She just wants to sing for you. Ben, what the hell are you doing? Get back here, I shouted, my heart hammering against my ribs. Let her in, his disembodied whisper continued. It's so peaceful in the water, she showed me. It's quiet and calm. Let her in. We were frozen in horror. Liam slowly raised his high-powered flashlight and pointed it in the direction of the voice. The beam cut through the rain and landed on Ben. He was standing at the edge of the trees, soaking wet from head to toe, his clothes covered in mud and river weed. He was smiling, a serene, empty smile. His eyes were vacant, and standing directly behind him with one long, pale hand on his shoulder was the faint, shimmering outline of a woman. She was blurry, indistinct, like a heat haze, but she was there. Her form was tall and slender, and she seemed to be draped in something long and white. We couldn't see her face, just the shape of her. Chloe screamed. Liam and I grabbed the door and slammed it shut, ramming the timber bar back into place. We could hear Ben's voice from right outside the door now, soft and persuasive. Open the door. Please, she misses having company. Then, the doorknob started to jiggle. Violently. Something was trying to force it open. We threw our bodies against the door, holding it shut as it rattled in its frame. We could hear Ben pleading, and behind his pleas, the low, sad humming grew louder and louder until it filled our heads, a maddening, endless loop. We stayed like that for what felt like a lifetime, barricaded in that rotten shack, listening to the voice of our friend trying to lure us to our deaths. Sometime before the sun came up, the rattling stopped. The humming faded. There was only silence. We didn't open the door until the sun was high in the sky. When we finally did, there was no one there. Just a set of muddy footprints leading from the door back towards the river. Ben was gone. A search and rescue team found us that afternoon, alerted by our families when we didn't check in. They searched for Ben for over a week. They found his body 10 miles downstream. The official coroner's report listed the cause of death as accidental drowning. The other 2 survivors and we never talk about it. How can you explain it? How can you tell a police officer that your friend was lured into a flooded river by a humming ghost? We tried to find local legends about the area afterward. We found one. A story from the 1890s about a young woman who was supposed to be married, but her fiancé left her. In her grief, she threw herself into the river, wearing her white wedding dress. They say that during great storms, when the river floods, her spirit walks the banks, humming her wedding song, looking for company in the water. We never went camping again. We can't. Because sometimes, when the rain is really heavy, I can still hear it. That faint, sad humming, just at the edge of my hearing. In college, I worked the closing shift at a coffee shop downtown. It was a decent gig, but it meant I often got home well after midnight. My usual route was a bus that dropped me off a few blocks from my apartment. It was a routine I could do in my sleep. But one night, routine shattered. A summer thunderstorm, the kind that appears out of nowhere with savage intensity, rolled over the city. It wasn't just rain, it was hail, lightning, and flash flood warnings. By the time I closed up shop, the streets were deserted and the bus service had been suspended. My only way home was the subway, the last train of the night. The station was eerie. It was one of the older, deeper ones, and it felt like descending into the city's guts. The air was thick and humid, and the concrete walls were weeping with condensation. Rainwater leaked from cracks in the ceiling, plinking into puddles on the grimy platform. I was the only person there. My footsteps echoed in the cavernous space, a lonely sound against the distant rumble of thunder that penetrated even this far underground. After a 10-minute wait that felt like an hour, the train finally came screeching out of the black tunnel, its headlights cutting through the gloom. The doors hissed open. I stepped inside a car that was brightly lit and completely empty. Almost. At the far end of the car, sitting by himself, was a man. He was huddled in a large, dark, soaking wet coat, the kind that looked too heavy for summer, even a rainy one. He wore a low-brimmed hat that cast his entire face in shadow. He didn't look up as I got on. I took a seat near the doors, as far away from him as I could. Not for any particular reason at first, just a subconscious need for personal space. The doors closed, sealing us in, and the train lurched forward into the tunnel. The journey was unsettling from the start. The lights inside the car flickered constantly, in time with the raging storm above. At the first stop, the doors opened to a deserted platform. No one got on, no one got off. The train just sat there, humming, for what felt like an unnaturally long time before the doors slid shut and we moved on. The same thing happened at the next stop, and the next. Just empty, silent stations, like ghost towns on the edge of the world. A weird sense of isolation began to creep over me. It felt like we were the only two people left alive, rattling through the veins of a dead city. I tried to distract myself with my phone, but there was no signal this deep. I put it away and just stared at my reflection in the dark window opposite. I could see the empty seats, the flickering lights, and at the far end of the car, the unmoving shape of the man in the heavy coat. He hadn't moved a single muscle since I got on. Not a shift in his seat, not a turn of his head. He was unnaturally still, the kind of stillness that isn't relaxed, but rigid, tense. I started watching him more closely in the reflection. Was he asleep? Passed out? It was impossible to tell. The brim of his hat was pulled down so low, all I could see was the hint of a chin. Then, halfway between stations, the train shuddered and screeched to a halt. The humming of the engine died. We were plunged into absolute suffocating darkness and silence, deep beneath the earth. The only sound was the faint, rhythmic drip of water somewhere inside the car. I held my breath. My heart started to pound a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Power outage. That had to be it. The storm must have knocked out the main power. The emergency lights would kick on any second. I waited. 1 second. 10 seconds. A full minute of pure, blind blackness. In the dark, my other senses went into overdrive. I could smell the ozone from the tracks, the damp concrete, and something else, a new smell. A foul, organic odor, like a swamp or a stagnant pond. It was getting stronger. Then, with a loud clank, the emergency lights flickered on. They were dim, casting a sickly, greenish-yellow glow over everything. I blinked, my eyes adjusting, and my blood ran cold. The man's seat at the far end of the car was empty. For a split second, I felt a wave of relief. He must have gotten off at the last stop, and I just hadn't noticed. But that didn't make sense. I would have heard him. I would have seen him. I scanned the empty car. He was gone. No, he wasn't gone. He was standing in the middle of the aisle, halfway down the car, much closer to me. He was perfectly still, his back partially to me, his head bowed down so his face was still hidden by the hat. He was just standing there. How did he get there? I didn't hear a single footstep. He had moved from one end of the car to the middle in 60 seconds of complete darkness, without making a sound. The train remained dead in the tunnel. I was trapped in this metal tube with him. I couldn't take my eyes off him. I watched his rigid, still form, waiting for him to do something, anything. The emergency lights flickered again. Off. On. He was closer. He hadn't walked. I was watching his feet. He was just there. 10 feet closer than he was a second ago. My breath hitched in my throat. This wasn't real. This couldn't be happening. The swampy smell was stronger now, emanating from him. I could see the floor around his shoes. They were leaving wet footprints on the linoleum. But it wasn't just water. It was dark and sludgy, with bits of what looked like rotted leaves and black algae mixed in. The lights flickered again. Off. On closer. He was only 20 feet away now. Still facing slightly away from me, head bowed. I could see the back of his sodden coat in more detail. It was stained and dark, and little trickles of filthy water were running from the hem to form a growing puddle at his feet. I finally found my legs. I scrambled backward, away from him, my hands slapping against the cold metal walls of the car. I backed away until I was at the opposite end, my back pressed against the door to the next car. My heart felt like it was going to explode. Flicker. Off. On. He was now at the head of the aisle, right where the seats began, 10 feet away. His head was still bowed. I could hear something now, over the frantic beating of my own heart. A soft, gurgling sound, like someone trying to breathe through water. I fumbled with the handle for the connecting door. My hands slick with sweat. It wouldn't budge. It was locked or jammed. I was trapped. I was going to die here. The main lights in the car suddenly buzzed and flickered back to life, blindingly bright after the gloom. For a moment, everything seemed normal again. And in that moment, the man moved. He lifted his head. I couldn't see a face. What was under the brim of that hat was just a void. A deep, wet, featureless shadow. He took a single slow, shambling step towards me. Then another. He was coming. The lights went out again. Total darkness. I screamed. I didn't hear him move, but I felt him. A sudden, intense cold right beside me. A hand colder than ice and dripping with slick, fall water clamped down on my shoulder. His grip was like iron. The gurgling sound was right in my ear. He leaned in close, and a whisper, a wet, decomposing sound that was barely human, slid into my brain. It wasn't words. It was a feeling. A feeling of immense age, of suffocating darkness, of being drowned in cold, black mud. Just as I felt I was about to pass out from sheer terror, the train lurched violently forward. The main lights flickered and then came on, staying on. I was thrown against the door. I screamed again and spun around. He was gone. The car was empty. I was alone. The train was moving again, picking up speed, as if nothing had happened. I stood there shaking, hyperventilating, my shoulder throbbing with a phantom cold where he had touched me. I looked down at the floor. The wet, muddy footprints were still there. They led from the far end of the car, stopping and starting in the places where I'd seen him appear, and ended right in front of where I was standing. My own personal trail of terror. The train pulled into my station. The doors hissed open. I bolted out onto the platform and didn't stop running until I was up on the street, in the rain, gasping the cold, clean air. I looked back at the train. The car I had been in was empty. The footprints were gone. I never took the subway again. I reported it, of course. They checked the security footage from the stations. They saw me get on an empty train. They saw me get off, looking terrified. They saw nothing else. The train logs showed no power failures or unscheduled stops in that tunnel that night. A few years later, out of a morbid curiosity that I probably should have suppressed, I did some research on the history of that particular subway line. I found an old city planning map from the early 1900s. The section of tunnel where my train had stopped runs directly underneath what used to be the old city potter's field, a burial ground for the indigent, the unknown. The records showed that a huge part of the cemetery had been badly flooded and washed away during a hurricane in 1903, long before the subway was built. Dozens of graves were disturbed, their contents lost to the mud and water. They just built the tunnel right through it. I don't know what got on that train with me that night, but I know it wasn't from the storm above. It was from the ground below, and it was just waiting for the last train home. Being a new parent is a special kind of exhausting. You operate in a state of perpetual, low-grade panic, and your brain is basically just a soup of sleep deprivation and anxiety. So, when my wife, Sarah, had to go away for the weekend to visit her sick mom, I was nervous. It would be my first time alone with our 3-month-old daughter, Lily. Just me and her for 48 hours. I thought the biggest challenges would be diapers and feeding schedules. I was so naive. A massive thunderstorm decided to park itself over our town that Saturday. The sky turned a bruised purple, and the rain came down in waves. By evening, the power was starting to flicker. I just put Lily down to sleep in her crib. I had the baby monitor set up, the camera mounted on the wall across from her crib, and the receiver with me downstairs. It had a battery backup, so I wasn't worried about the power. I was on the couch, trying to watch a movie over the rumble of thunder, when the receiver next to me crackled to life. It was mostly static, which I figured was interference from the storm. But through the hiss and pop, I thought I heard something else. A voice. It was incredibly faint, a low, guttural whisper that I couldn't make out. I muted the TV, listening intently. The static cleared for a moment, and I heard it again. A man's voice whispering. I turned the volume up. I still couldn't understand what he was saying. It sounded distant, distorted. My first thought was that the monitor was picking up a stray signal. A neighbor's phone call, or another monitor. It was a common enough issue. Still, it was unsettling. I took the receiver with me and went upstairs to check on Lily. I quietly pushed open her nursery door. She was fast asleep in her crib, her little chest rising and falling rhythmically. The room was peaceful and quiet. There was no whispering. I stood there for a minute, just listening, feeling a bit foolish. It had to be crosstalk. I went back downstairs. I sat back on the couch, and the whispering started again. This time it was clearer. He was speaking numbers. Just numbers. In a flat, monotonous tone. 741993. On and on it went, a meaningless, endless string of digits. It was bizarre, and deeply creepy. Why would anyone be reciting numbers like that? I tried changing the channel on the monitor, cycling through the 4 available frequencies. But the voice was on every single one. Sometimes clearer, sometimes more buried in static, but it was always there. The numbers guy. I was starting to get genuinely freaked out. The logical part of my brain was still telling me it was interference, but the sleep-deprived new dad part was screaming that something was very wrong. Around 10 p.m. the house was plunged into darkness. The power went out for good. The TV died, the lamps went out. The only light was the faint, ghostly green glow from the screen of the baby monitor receiver in my hand. For a few minutes, there was silence from the speaker. The numbers had stopped. I held my breath, waiting. The silence somehow more menacing than the whispering had been. Then a new sound came through the receiver. It was a woman's voice. She was singing. A lullaby. It wasn't Sarah's voice. It wasn't a recorded lullaby from one of Lily's toys. The melody was strange, discordant, and ancient sounding. The voice was thin and reedy, and horribly off-key. It was the most unsettling sound I have ever heard in my life. It made the hairs on my arms stand on end. I grabbed the big mag light from the kitchen drawer and started creeping up the stairs, the receiver clutched in my other hand. The singing got louder and clearer as I got closer to the nursery. It was as if the source was right there. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. The singing was coming from my daughter's room. I reached the nursery door, which I had left slightly ajar. I pushed it open slowly, shining the flashlight beam inside. I swept the light across the room. The rocking chair was empty. The closet door was closed. I moved the beam to the crib. Lily was still sound asleep, completely undisturbed. She hadn't made a sound. My eyes then went to the baby monitor camera on the wall. The little red infrared light was on, indicating it was working in the dark. As I watched, my blood turned to ice. The camera, a simple, fixed position camera that had no panning function whatsoever, was moving. It was panning across the room, slowly, mechanically. Its little electronic eye was scanning the nursery. The eerie lullaby was still pouring out of the receiver in my hand, but the camera itself was moving on its own. I stood there, paralyzed, watching this impossible thing happen. The camera panned past the crib. It panned past the rocking chair. And then it stopped. It stopped, pointing directly at the far corner of the room. A dark, Empty corner next to the window. The singing on the receiver stopped abruptly. There was a click, a burst of static, and then a new voice came through. It was different from the numbers guy and the singing woman. This voice was a child's. A little girl, whispering clearly, directly into my ear from the receiver in my hand. It said 3 words. "He's watching you." My head snapped up from the receiver. I swung the flashlight beam from the crib to the corner the camera was staring at. For 1/10 of a second, I saw it. The beam of my flashlight illuminated the silhouette of a man. He was standing in the corner. He was unnaturally tall and thin, his limbs like sticks, his head nearly touching the 10-foot ceiling. He was just a shape of pure blackness against the dark wall. And then the bulb in my flashlight blew with a pop, plunging me into total darkness. I didn't scream. I didn't even think. Primal, paternal instinct took over. I lunged across the room in the dark, my hands finding the crib. I scooped Lily up into my arms. She woke up and started to cry. I didn't care. I held her tight to my chest and ran. I ran out of the room, down the stairs, not daring to look back. I didn't stop for shoes or a jacket. I wrenched the front door open and ran out into the pouring rain, Lily screaming against my shoulder. I didn't stop until I was banging on my neighbor's door, soaking wet, hysterical. The police came. They went through my house with flashlights. The back door was locked. All the windows were secure. There was no sign of a break-in, no muddy footprints, nothing. They found the baby monitor camera, still pointing at the empty corner. They were polite, but I could see it in their eyes. They thought I was a stressed-out new father who had cracked, hallucinating in the storm. Sarah came home the next day. She didn't believe me, not really. She thought I'd had a waking nightmare. She tried to be understanding, but she wanted to prove to me that it was all in my head. The baby monitor had an SD card in it that recorded clips when it detected motion. She wanted us to watch it together, to see that there was nothing there. I dreaded it, but I agreed. We put the card in the computer. Most of the files were just short clips of Lily squirming in her sleep. Then we got to the files from that night. They were mostly just blackness and static, corrupted by the power outages. But the last file was from the moment right before I entered the room. The video was grainy, shot in the black and white of the infrared night vision. We watched as the camera, impossibly, started to pan across the room on its own. It moved past the crib, just as I'd seen it. It stopped, pointing at that dark, empty corner. For about 5 seconds, the image was still. Nothing but a dark corner. Sarah looked at me, a soft, sympathetic expression on her face. "See, honey, there's nothing." She stopped talking, because just before the clip ended, 2 tiny, bright pinpricks of light appeared in the center of the dark corner. They glowed for a fraction of a second, like an animal's eyes reflecting light. But they weren't low to the ground. They were high up, almost at the ceiling. Then the video cut out. We put the house on the market the following week. We sold it at a loss. I threw that baby monitor in a dumpster. I don't know what was in our house that night. I don't know how it got in, or what it wanted. But I know it was real. And sometimes, late at night, when I'm checking on my daughter, I see a dark corner in her room and I feel that same cold dread. And I can't help but think it's watching. The rain can be a curtain. Sometimes it hides things we can't explain. A lonely spirit on a flooded road. A watcher in the storm, a hungry ghost in the woods. A passenger from a place we cannot see. A voice from an empty room. These stories remind us that when the world is washed away by the storm, and we are tucked safely in our homes, we might not be as alone as we think. Thank you for listening. Stay safe.